Flash is dead. At the beginning of this year, Adobe officially ceased distribution and support of its once ubiquitous Flash player, and major web browsers have disabled the Flash plugin. The previously universal internet technology, after having been deprecated for years, has reached its end of life. Part 1. Flash gained popularity in part because of the ecosystem at the time. It served a set of needs for web development that weren't being met by other tools in the late 90s, but also because of its ease of use. As a tool designed for animation, it wasn't code first, which allowed basic web pages to be built with less expertise than editing raw HTML. And later, when it added support for more complex interaction via ActionScript, it allowed for games and other interactive digital art to be built with astoundingly little programming knowledge. Making a game in Flash also meant not having to purchase hardware dev kits or license expensive software like is required to develop for consoles. While the cost of a legal version of Flash was still quite a barrier and did affect the demographics of Flash creators, it was still a drastically lower price point than alternative game engines, which were still primarily being sold for enterprise use. As far as usability, it was far more accessible than the other alternative of building an engine from scratch using low-level programming languages like C. That lowered barrier to creation meant that more people were able to make games and that they could do so in less time with fewer resources, which opened the floodgates to all sorts of experimentation. Entire genres like tower defense, room escape, and endless runners were born and immediately boomed because of that experimentation. It cannot be overstated how valuable that broad experimentation was for pushing games forward as an art form. Anyone could upload their work to a Flash portal and have their work seen, but something else we got from those Flash portals was a lower barrier to consumption. Being free to play was a huge plus. Most of them were short enough to be done within maybe an hour, and it's easy to downplay the significance of being playable in a web browser. Websites hosting the games were designed in a way that removed overhead of playing something new, so it felt a lot more like clicking through the recommended videos on YouTube. I used to spend a lot of my afternoons, before they were getting lost to the void of social media, just browsing whatever short Flash games came up in the recommendations. Whereas using a digital distribution platform, cost of games aside, devs gotta eat. The process of playing something new is simply more involved. Having to download a game just has more overhead, between the extra steps to access it and having to wait for the download to finish. And any links to other games are just out of the way. Even on itch, which is a platform I have no shortage of good things to say about, you have to navigate to a separate page to see similar games. And like when you're browsing Netflix, it's hard to pick out one thing when you're looking at a page full of choices. There was a lot of experimentation in Flash, and looking back, that's actually when I had the most exposure to a lot of experimental work. Even more so than when I was studying and making similar experimental games for a master's degree. I was enamored by the art games that were gaining popularity at the end of the aughts. The loss of pervasive web games means that experimental work is now simply less accessible to audiences. There were, of course, problems that came with wide accessibility as well. The early ecosystem was dominated by edgy design sensibilities fitting that of early adolescent boys, humor in the fact that the content was upsetting to people and transgressive in a way that was uncritical of the norms being transgressed. Since Newgrounds as a community formed around works like Club a Seal, which is about exactly what you'd expect, it really shouldn't come as a surprise that toxicity continued to permeate the site, and that the women who pioneered Flash in the late 90s were pushed out of the space. Of all the influences Flash had on the gaming ecosystem that persist to today, the most prominent is that it brought about the rise of the modern indie scene. Flash development was an indie scene in itself, characterized primarily by small teams or individuals working as hobbyists without a budget. The Flash ecosystem of the mid to late aughts saw developers being paid enough through sponsorships and ad revenue to support themselves. In addition to that, small games seeing viral attention resulted in deals with publishers, which allowed the developers to turn their small browser games into larger products. That model is what paved the way for the indie business model that's broadly in use now. Flash is also where casual games largely originated. Because of the accessibility of browser-based games to broader audiences, a lot of people who wouldn't have otherwise played many games at all began playing things like repetitive puzzle games like Bejeweled or a Sea of Tetris clones that don't have a high cognitive load as time fillers. When Facebook entered the scene and began hosting social games like Farmville, they used a monetization model that translated almost seamlessly when the shift to mobile happened. Part 2. Flash's use as a tool for making games was actually incidental. It happened as a side effect of the tool's features, as an animation tool that incorporated interactive elements for dynamic web pages. And to only talk about how it shaped the field of games would do a massive disservice to its legacy and its importance as a technology. It had just as substantial an impact on so many other fields like animation, web page design, and online video, but more importantly than any single field it touched, Flash shaped the web as we know it. Flash allowed for multimedia on the internet. Prior to its widespread adoption, most of the internet was built around a hypertext structure. Even images were an afterthought. Interaction was typically flat consumption of page content, not unlike how one would interact with a physical book. Flash made it easier not only to boost a web page's interactivity, but also make the pages more vibrant in general. Newgrounds was one of the first sites on the web to automate user submission of content in a way that we take for granted in the current social media landscape. Other sites around the web, not just Flash portals, quickly followed suit, which paved the way for the kind of participatory culture that most of the internet landscape has since formed around. Throughout its lifespan, we can actually use Flash as a lens for looking at the ideologies that have shaped the internet. In its early days, Flash was a realization of the ideals that formed the early web of widespread accessibility to knowledge and culture, and its downfall, starting in the 20-teens, represented a turn away from those ideals in the structure of the net and toward neoliberalism. When mobile technology was adopted, its design was centered around a storefront model, which has yet to change. Any software and extended functionality of a device has to, in some way, go through a digital storefront operated by the device's manufacturer. iPhones in particular have always been designed to be a walled garden, and more than anything else, Apple's decision not to support Flash was a rejection of openness in the design of their platform. They locked the gate on access to digital culture. The emergence of mobile coincided with the rise of digital distribution platforms like Steam, which was beneficial to indie publishing, but combined with the downfall of Flash, it moved the web toward professionalization of online culture. The other major shift that motivated that professionalization was through social media. Rather than browsing a web of smaller private websites and inhabiting online spaces that people and communities built for themselves, the landscape of digital spaces we inhabit has all but been monopolized by a handful of massive social media sites. That means the way culture is distributed on the web these days is primarily mediated by large corporate-owned platforms that privilege high production quality. If we look at the predominant content on YouTube in the first few years of the website's life, it was mostly produced by young adults who bought a cheap camera and just started making videos for fun. Compared to today, where the visible content is largely being made by teams of full-time professionals. The reason Flash added scripting that supported game making was because someone hacked together a pinball game in Flash 2. when the only interactive elements were buttons to control where the current frame was along the timeline, by drawing a keyframe for every ball location on the playfield as a state machine. ActionScript was added in response to projects like that pinball game that pushed the boundaries of the tool in creative ways, because the developers at Macromedia wanted to foster the creative potential of the tool's users. Despite being closed software, it was, at the time, a democratic technology, because its development was driven by the active participation of its users. When it changed hands to Adobe following their acquisition of Macromedia, the tool's design and features changed according to the company's values. Over time, they were increasingly focused on Flash's application for high-end games and enterprise development. So much so that when they updated the ActionScript compiler to version 2, they prioritized features for high-end development so heavily that it was largely inaccessible to amateurs. Chiefly among those changes was the removal of support for ActionScript 2, which was the most widespread entry point for amateurs. Those changes were made in response to changing revenue models, since that's when microtransaction games were starting to be highly profitable, and supporting that was where Adobe stood to make the most profit. It was not just the environment of changing technology that killed Flash. Adobe also killed Flash. The conflicting ideologies at play in Flash's fight for survival were primarily centered around openness of technology. One of the major criticisms of Flash was that it was closed-source software and that the web should operate on open standards and frameworks. But that was largely a rhetorical smokescreen. Paradoxically, open standards like HTML5 turned out to be closed platforms, where Flash, as a closed software, was still an astoundingly open platform. The final nail in the coffin was that even though Adobe made moves to open Flash's source, they abandoned its openness as a platform. Part 3. While Adobe as a business has ceased its support, Flash as a piece of software still exists, and is still being used for all sorts of work outside web browsers. The Flash Player browser plugin may no longer be supported by major browsers, but there are downloadable players available, emulators that operate in the browser, and even some obscure browsers that continue to support the plugin. There have been a handful of major efforts to preserve Flash games coming from portals like Congregate and Newgrounds, and collections of private individuals like Flashpoint and the Flash Game Archive. All of the game footage in this video was filmed since the start of May of this year, months after Flash Player's end of life. When I was in high school, at the end of the aughts, I really wanted to get into making my own Flash games, but despite my best efforts, never really managed to figure out how to get started. I think that's the only opportunity I missed in high school that I really continue to regret a decade later. So as part of this video, I decided to learn Flash and finally make my first Flash game, to pay my respects. Flash has carved out its place in history and is one of the most important and influential pieces of digital technology that has existed, whether it's remembered as such or not. It is outlived by its influence on digital culture and will continue to further influence our digital landscape far into the future. Long live Flash!